Hi guys, my name is Zachariah Buerta. I'm the founder of Flawed Art Acting, de Ijver, Bloeit, Kunst. And we are an acting studio. We practice contemporary acting and we are rooted in our storytelling lineage. And previously we talked about contemporary acting and Konstantin Stanislavski. And in this video we'll be talking about our roots, our storytelling lineage, which is the South African storytelling lineage. But before we do, folks, please go and like this video, like and subscribe, and let's get into this. Every country and every culture has a distinct storytelling lineage. You recognize a country, what they value, what their worldview and beliefs are, through the stories that they tell and how they tell those stories. The storytelling lineage is a mirror unto that country and its people. This is with which they recognize themselves. You can recognize Americans, and Americans can recognize themselves through Hollywood films and network television. You recognize the UK through the British sitcoms, the period and fantasy shows. It is a distinct way which you can get to observe their worldview, their beliefs. And it's the same with South Africa. We recognize ourselves as South Africans through our stand-up comedy, our parody adverts, our soap operas, our struggle plays. But what I want to explore with you, let me just see if I'm recording here. Yes. What I want to explore with you is the moment in time in South Africa's history where our storytelling lineage, specifically in the 1800s, started bearing that familiar, distinctly South African character types and humor and social commentary traditions, which is commonplace in South Africa today. And the historic figure, the person in our history who helped start and establish this lineage. Whew. All right, so let's get into it. We are going to start in Cape Town in the 17 and 1800s. I'm just going to set up for you how it looked back in the day. Cape Town was home to many different groups of people. Sailors, settler colonists, soldiers, slaves, indigenous communities, and employees of the East India Trading Company, and later employees of the Crown, the British Empire. Now, general storytelling and performances in this period of time was dominated by European culture. And because we're talking about acting, it was definitely dominated by European performance culture. 1781. French soldiers were brought into Cape Town and they brought with them French culture, comédie française, and bootleg performances of the plays Barber of Seville and Figaro from the French playwright, and excuse me if I'm butchering this name, Pierre Beaumarchais. Pierre Beaumarchais, yes. Now, when the English took over, after the Dutch East India Trading Company left, the first European-style theatre was built, the African theatre. And this is where military personnel performed together, members of the public formed amateur theatre groups to perform in the African theatre. Plays were in English and in German and in Dutch and in French. Just a reflection on the classes of people, the groups who were stationed in Cape Town in this period of time. And there was also a tradition of adopting mottos as the names of these theatre groups. With the Dutch, it's the same. It is exactly the same with Ridderrijkerskamers, debate rooms or rooms of rhetoric. But basically, you would use a motto that describes the ethos of your group the best. That is what people would call you. And there were three big ones in the Cape in this period of time. The first one with the English was the theatre group All the World's a Stage. The second one with the Dutch was Tot nut in vermaak. And with the French, Honi Sukumalu Pen. So those were the three prominent amateur theatre groups in Cape Town. But if you think about modern South Africa, multilingualism, the ability to speak and understand multiple languages, that's a very respected part of our society. You're very respected if you're able to do it. If you think about very famous South Africans, Trevor Noah, for example, his ability with his stand-up comedy to move between the groups of people, it's very respected in our society. So it's just apt to say that this melting pot environment was a crucial foundation for our storytelling lineage. And now we enter to the historical figure, Charles Etienne Boniface, born 2 February 1787 in Paris into a French aristocratic family who were displaced during the French Revolution. Charles arrived in Cape Town in February of 1807. And Charles could speak many different European languages. French, his mother tongue, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Latin, Greek, as well as English and German. And whilst he lived in Cape Town, he acquired Dutch as well as a spoken language. He was trained in music, in classical guitar, dance and fencing, the sword fighting. And in Cape Town, he primarily worked as a language teacher. Now, Charles was a central figure in the Cape Theatre Society. He wrote his first play, De Dolzinnige of de Gewaande Dolle Man, the frenzied or the reputed madman, and staged it in 1807. He also adapted, translated, and revised many European plays like Le Martelier's Robert Chef de Brugon. He adapted Molière's Le Bourgeoisie Gentleman, in Dutch to De Burger Edelman, and his most prolific writings in his lifetime were literary works wherein he made his enemies the object of ridicule. So he was infamous for his public feuds. He would create characters and these farcical sketches and situations about his enemies or about contentious topics that were happening in Cape Town in that period of time, with letters and then newspaper articles and then eventually original plays and then later theater performances. And the first major public feud to inspire this more prolific dramatic work, which he's remembered for, was his feud with his estranged friend and collaborator and mentor, Suwasu de Lima. Now, in 1823, Boniface and de Lima used to be collaborators and friends. De Lima helped Boniface translate Molière's Bourgeoisie Gentleman into De Burger Edelman. He lived for a brief moment of time. He shared accommodation with de Lima, and he benefited from de Lima's patronage. There was a time that he called him his mentor. But by 1824, this relationship had soured. Boniface's theatre group had a series of performance postponements and cancellations. And 27 October 1824, de Lima published a poem in the newspaper, the South African Chronicle, titled Everyone is Disappointed. And I'm going to give you the translation of it, in the segment of it in English. He critiqued Boniface by saying, yes, even the stage of mirrors toward which time swiftly moves, one enters seeking amusement, yet finds oneself disappointed. Now, Boniface took this poem as an insult, and he responded himself with his own poem where he demotes Suas de Lima from a poet to a mere rhymester, a rymelaar. Now, this public fallout caused the two men to attack each other with newspaper column letters. So they would submit letters either as the director of a theater group or as the poet or other pseudonyms, and they would critique each other and diss each other. And this went on for about a year. And it became something of a Siem in the Lawn soap opera in the newspapers. And in August of 1825, Boniface took this feud between him and his ex-collaborator friend de Lima to the stage. And he adapted August von Kotzebue's play, The Comedy at the Window, and he retitles it Lima kom de dichter, Snail the Poet. Now this is where you start to get an understanding of Boniface. Limakon is wordplay on the word de Lima. Limakon means snail, and de Lima was de Lima's surname. Now, the audience, having followed this feud for over a year, understood that Limakon referred to de Lima. But not just de Lima, but de Lima's hunchback posture. So it was a twofold diss in disguise. And the day that Limakon de Dichter was set to premiere, de Lima responds with publishing a dialogue and calling it Samenspraak tussen Limakon, 'n digter, en 'n prosaic Gascon. Dialogue between Limakon the poet and the prosaic Gascon. And then Boniface would, in turn of this published monologue, the next day reply by publishing a monologue named De Twee Slakke, Limakon Senior en Limakon Junior. The two snails, Limakon Senior and Limakon Junior. Now, of the performed play and the monologue and the dialogue, the play, we can't read it. It doesn't exist. It wasn't published. There's no manuscripts available. But there are copies that exist of the monologue and the dialogue. Boniface would probably have made just a few changes with von Kotzebue's comedy at the window, just to ridicule de Lima. But Boniface did write that if he really wanted to tackle de Lima, he would write an original piece, quite different in content, which we will get to a little later. Now, in form, the monologue and the dialogue is a bit different. De Lima's dialogue is a very dignified, high Dutch tone, and he condemns Boniface from a very high moral standpoint. That was de Lima's style. But Boniface's tone in his monologue is very different. He likes to destroy his enemies with biting mockery, and he likes to use very personal revelations or information that he would know of his enemies, because usually they used to be friends, and that he would use publicly and attack his foe. And you know that is the two main things about this feud between the two. And this sets the tone for future writings of Boniface as how he would deal with his frenemies to come. Very interesting. Now, what this Boniface de Lima feud reveals is a developing trend in the Cape in the 1800s. People who were skilled would, through characters who use informal language and dialogue, voice their opinions in newspaper letters. So many journalists would create characters that were recognizable from society, character types. For example, the typical burger, which is what the Boer, the colonists would speak like, or the indigenous vagabonds, or the English aristocrat, or the foreigner with very broken Dutch. And this is how they would express their opinions on events in the Cape. And it contains a very familiar style of South African humour. And if you were to adapt those letters to modern spellings in Afrikaans, for example, it would find a lot of resonance with South Africans today. Here's a letter from the Cape Burger, from a letter written by Jan Ternou in 1826. Most likely Suwasu de Lima wrote this letter. Okay, Dutch and then English. Aan de Kaap, 'n hond meer vooraf hyf as 'n mens. Want as die mens nags in hulle huis vrolik is en 'n beetje spektakel maak, dan word hulle dat belet. Maar al maak die honde nog soveel spektakel op straat, dan word al niets gedaan. In the Cape, dogs have more rights than people. For if the people get jolly in the evening, and they make a bit of spectacle, they get fined. But even if a dog makes a huge spectacle, nothing happens to them. So, as a reader, you're not just reading the letter when you speak it, you're hearing out aloud this relatable South African character from the 1800s come to life. Because remember, we're talking about our storytelling lineage here. Now, Boniface capitalized on this trend. Now, a few years later, after 1825, we go to 1830. And this is where Boniface helps establish the first political Dutch journal, newspaper journal, De Zuid-Afrikaan, the South African. And he became its editor. And interestingly enough, Boniface acquired the machinery and the press material necessary by the bankruptcy auction of Suwasu de Lima. So Suwasu de Lima also had a newspaper, the Versamelaar, the collector. It failed. He went bankrupt. And in an auction sale for debt, Boniface bought the machinery and the stock. And that's what he used to start the Zuid-Afrikaan. And for 6 months, Boniface was the editor of the Zuid-Afrikaan. The Zuid-Afrikaan was his stage. He would develop his style there, these feuds and letters and articles. This is where all of this really starts to permeate and develop. He would have sharp opinions. He would have vivid characterizations, unapologetic mockery, personality-driven writing, which parallels talk shows like that of Trevor Noah of The Daily Show and more recently Dan Corder with The Dan Corder Show. But after 6 months, Boniface was fired as the editor because he got too personal. He attacked too many people. You can't keep a person like that on the newspapers in 1830. And what he did show to early South African societies at that time was that South African public discourse can be theatrical. Now, during his 6 months manning the Zuid-Afrikaan in the Cape, there was a court case, Mackay v. Phillip. This is where Dr. John Phillip of the London Missionary Society published a controversial book, Researches in South Africa. And there he alleged that the magistrate of Somerset had flogged and imprisoned an indigenous labour in 1825 for brandy that he had stolen, and also, forced his family into indentured servitude for 3 years. Now, Boniface took it upon himself to be the spokesman of his fellow countrymen in the Zuid-Afrikaan articles and defend the Cape Burgers of the accusation that they had been drinking immoderately and they had been abusing their workforce, as alleged in Dr. Philip's book. And then he published an imaginary dialogue between himself and the labourer, Hendrik, who was allegedly abused by the magistrate. This I'm also going to be reading right now, but I'm going to jump in straight into English. The Zuid-Afrikaan published the pages in both English and Dutch. So this is from the English section of that. I was a bit of a scallum back then. I was in Moonjoy's service, bringing a wagon with a half-arm of brandy from Cradock to Somerset. A man is but a man, you know, and I was alone. And the road was long. I grew tired and thirsty. Sigh. The cask was right there beside me. I felt the temptation. So I took my ox horn and I just tapped a little, only a hornful at a time, you understand, and I drank. And afterwards I drank a little more. I was very thirsty and the brandy was good. Then I stopped using the horn and I took the whole reed and pumped straight from the cask itself. The cask did grow a little empty, yes, but I filled it up again with water. Ha! Yes, sir, I was a scallum, a cunning scallum in those days. Now, the questions in the dialogue was asked in Dutch, and the cook would answer in early Afrikaans. So I had when it was written in Dutch, it was mimicking the Afrikaans dialect that Hendrik was speaking. And this is one of the first pieces of literature documenting the use of Afrikaans pre-1875, pre the first Afrikaans language movement. Now, Boniface sketches Hendrik's appearance as with some exaggeration, but it is through Hendrik's speech and his thought patterns and the language use that his character comes truly alive. He speaks with a humour and a self-awareness where he recounts his thirst and his temptation and his weakness for not being able to help himself to the bit of brandy as he was very thirsty and the journey was oh so arduous. Now this is a clear dramatic progression from caricature to ridicule your enemy to creating a relatable character based on local character types, with local vocabulary dialogue and a relatable point of view storytelling to connect with your readers who were the audience in the Cape. Now Boniface takes this leap with South African storytelling even further. And again with our good old friend Dr. John Philip. When Dr. John Philip decides in January of 1832, with a circle of local revenants and reformers to convene a public meeting in Cape Town and start the Cape of Good Hope Temperance Society. Now, temperance societies were moral reform movements in the US and the UK. They believed that social problems amongst the working class and indigenous populations could be solved by abstaining from strong alcohol, particularly brandy and distilled alcohol, but wine was often exempt. Now for Boniface, the problem was not moderation itself, but who claimed authority to define it and how they went about enforcing it. This founding meeting in January was a complete theatrical farce. Reverends were shouting at each other and banging the tables. Women left the hall in embarrassment after certain respectable men had invoked chastity in crude speeches. And apparently this was supposed to be a private meeting, and women weren't allowed to attend. And members who voiced their opinions were thrown out in this meeting. So it was a... But the assumption that local people or people, residents of the Cape, lacked self-discipline and that their habits were uniquely degenerate reignited Boniface's writing impulse. But this time, newspaper articles and character letters and dialogues was not enough. So, Boniface publishes a 4-act, 200-page satirical comedy based in Cape Town called De Nieuwe Ridderorde of the Temperentisten. The New Night Order or the Temperists. This is his largest and most ambitious work. A sprawling ensemble piece with nearly 30 characters, 29 total, written primarily in Dutch with extensive use of Latin and Afrikaans. Somebody's bothering us right now. Now, this play is Moliere's Tartuffe meets Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It is not a subtle satire. It is an exuberant, chaotic, deliberately excessive play where Dr. Philip and his circle are caricatured as hypocritic drunk knights who preach abstinence whilst under the influence of gin. Now, every character's name is either a characteristic of Dr. Philip and his colleagues, or it is an embedded insult, and it's complete with absurd character behavior and dialogue that reflects their flaws and sins in regards to their presumption of being morally authoritative over abstinence. Now, the characters are divided in 4 factions. You got the Temperance Knights, with characters like Reverend Humbug Philip Pumpkin. Philip Pumpkin is Pampoenkop, that is Dr. Philip's character. Dr. Delirium Tremens, that alcohol withdrawal disease. Moffie von Pochtman Dreiloor, Moffie being von Pochtman Dreiloor, it's just the mute German knight, Dreiloor deaf. And then you had the anti-temperists. The brandy distillers, the lawyers and the merchants and the ordinary Cape burgers who oppose the movement, like characters like Bob Going Gone, and Dr. McThirsty, Call His Son, and then the apprentice temperists who are, interestingly enough, the Scotsman, the Irishman, the Englishman, aptly named Jacko Groggy, Tommy Sibdrums, and Andrew Everdry. And then we have the indigenous characters, the most significant group of the play. You have Hans Drooggekeel, Piet Dronkenlap, characters like Manus Kalfachter, who are widely understood to be the continuation of the character Hendrik Kok, introduced earlier with Boniface's interview. And many of these characters speak with the same idiom and the same logic and the same humor as Hendrik Kok. And then, of course, you get Grietjie Drillbouten, which means, I think I could translate it as Grietjie, name Grietjie, Drillbouten, I think fat ass. That's a crude way, a big bomb. And she represents the early indigenous female character type. She will be later counterparted in the comic song of Andrew Geddes Baines, Kaikie Cackleback. And all these characters speak an early form of Afrikaans. They use the local rhythms. They have imagery and irony that is relatable to South African audiences today. They're just recognizable as the indigenous people that live in the Cape. It's just, you read them and you understand. It's these people. What? We know them. It's written like that 200 plus years ago. Now, what makes the Nieuwe Ridderorde crucial with South African storytelling is this. Boniface fully fuses satire and character archetypes with multilingual dialogue laced with social commentary to create a single original work intended for a South African audience. This builds directly on the newspaper culture of character letters and dialogues, but it expands into a theatrical world populated with recognisable South African types. It embeds insults in the character names, and it's very familiar if you were to adapt it into modern Afrikaans. And it creates this uncanny continuity between 19th century satire and contemporary speech if you were to contemporize it. Now, this play was most certainly never performed. The size and the complexity and the political sharpness makes that very unlikely. But as a reading play, it survives as a blueprint, as to a proof of concept, if you will, as to what South African satire could become. So in this regards, the Nieuwe Ridderorde is an unfinished piece of work. But it demands adaptation and translation and performance because it's not a museum piece. This is a living satire. One that speaks uncannily well to a society that still wrestles with moral authority and public virtue and private contradiction. You know, this isn't just Boniface at his most ambitious. This is South Africa finding its voice. Now, let's look at another piece. Remember what I said earlier about Boniface and de Lima. If the Nieuwe Ridderorde was Boniface's sprawling satirical universe, then Clasius is Boniface's deliberate return to his arch nemesis, Suasu de Lima. Now, by 1834, 9 years after Limakon, the dichter, Snail, the poet, the Limakon plays and newspaper exchanges already established a pattern where Boniface turned his private grievance into public ridicule, but Clasius is where Boniface fulfills his promise that if he wanted to write a play about de Lima, he would surely do so. Now, this time, with this play, Boniface didn't just caricature de Lima's professional persona. He draws directly from de Lima's personal circumstance. Most notably, de Lima leaving his wife for his mistress. And this is where, that's a difference. It's like, de Lima left his wife? I'm going to write a play about that. Now, what makes Clasius also very different from Boniface's other work was where Boniface was with his career at that moment. Now, 1830s Boniface was doing extremely well. He was riding off the success of his sold-out reading play, De Nieuwe Ridderorde. He took control of one of Cape Town's leading theatrical groups, and he renamed it Flawed Kunst. And he was firmly at the center of the Cape Town theater life. And in this period, this year, 1834, he had already staged productions, including Pygmalion, his adaptation, De Burger Edelman, and then this piece, Clasius. Now, Clasius, of De gekweste reputasie of 'n proses om 'n komedieloetjie of nog net so, translated to a lawsuit over a comedy ticket, is a 2-act satirical farce where the central character, Clasius Stupidus Bavianus, Clasius the stupid baboon, was a barely disguised caricature of Delima. Now, Clasius lives under the protection of Lenora, his landlady and mistress, whom he is financially dependent on. And then when a theatre company refuses him a ticket for a performance, Clasius interprets this as an insult on his honor, and then he launches a lawsuit. The case collapses, the costs fall on Lenora, and Boniface piles insults on insults in this play in regards to Delima's failed marriage, his professional pretensions, his financial instability, his physical appearance. There is a page where you can see a sketch of Clasius that's in the original manuscript. Now, he even extends the play by adding a scene where a taxidermied baboon gets brought on stage, wherein comparisons are drawn between the baboon and Clasius. Ja, nee, Boniface was a regte doos. Now, this comedy relies very heavily on situation instead of psychological depth. There's a lot of interruptions and misunderstandings and exaggerated reactions, and there's a slow unraveling of Clasius's imagined dignity. Now, Boniface follows an established trend of character names based off of caricature or knowledge of the victim of his play's personal life. He continues this with his last play, The Padiscordian. Clasius is written as an opera comique. It's a musical. It's complete with rhyme schemes, and somebody helped compose music for it. Now, like I said, the manuscript which exists in the archives does have a sketch, a watercolor caricature of Suasu de Lima, which emphasizes his baboon-like features. Clasius Stupidus Bavianus, Clasius the stupid baboon. Now, Boniface this time, not Boniface, Delima this time responded by suing. He sued following the performance of Clasius on 19 July 1834. He brought an action for damages of £200 against Boniface and the managers of Fluit and Kunst. He claimed injury to his reputation, but the case was dismissed due to a technicality, and Lima couldn't continue further because he didn't have any money. So when you take a step back from Boniface and you stop looking at these individual feuds and it becoming original plays, there's something more profound happening here. The letters in the newspapers, the people writing with pseudonym names, these character voice letters, which slowly turn into recognizable people in society that they know, and where they live, and they begin to talk about their situations and their life in the Cape. It starts on the page of the newspapers and becomes something much more theatrical. And then the page starts behaving like the stage. And the feuds matter not because they're petty, they are very petty, but because it turns the storytelling inward. And instead of just retelling European stories or borrowing distant settings, the writers started excavating their immediate world. They looked at the streets of Cape Town, the court cases in Somerset, the public meetings gone awry, scandals and personality clashes and hypocrisies of certain groups of people. Real people becoming character types, and public behavior becoming drama and entertainment. Satire became a vehicle through which society started seeing itself. It became a mirror unto themselves. It's the crucial threshold, the moment these familiar types and stories are no longer read but performed. The performance changes everything. Once a story is spoken out aloud, it is embodied, it is laughed at, it is experienced collectively. It stops being commentary and it starts becoming a reflection of society. The audience becomes engaged. They recognize themselves, they recognize their neighbors, their leaders, their beliefs, their innate contradictions. That is the moment when the storytelling lineage truly begins. Whew, wow. Right, let me just do this. Right. Now, Boniface reached that point with the performance of Clasius. It wasn't because he was noble or the hero of South African storytelling. He wasn't. He was kind of a dick. But his temperament and his nature drove him there. His inability to let things go, his instinct to retaliate through language, his theatrical sensibility. It all combined to produce something unprecedented. Original plays set in South Africa, with stories about early South African societies, and it's written and performed for South Africans. With Clasius, we're not dealing anymore with borrowed forms alone, but we're dealing with local life that is transformed into theater. We're dealing with local life that is transformed into theater. Now, Boniface went on to write a few more plays after he achieved success with Clasius, the pettifogging lawyer's plot, and the plays in his Bloeit like the Padiscordian, and he continued his style of personality-driven drama and satire with character types based on real people from his life, and the inspiration still derived from a place of wanting to critique his friends turned enemies. But it was his temperament and part of the allure as to why... it was his temperament and part of the allure as to why... it was his temperament and part of his personality what led him to write these characters, which we now know today about him because many linguists studied his work to explore his dramatic work because of it. That's the reason why Boniface's material is available in archives, because his temperament and his personality, it kept it there. People kept copies of it. It's available in the archives in the National Library of South Africa. But I want to tell you this. It's also his personality, which was part of the reason as to why he was driven out of Cape Town and Durban and became outcasts in both those societies. Communities tend to outgrow negativity and they ostracize misunderstood individuals with misunderstood personalities. But Boniface's effects and his contribution to our storytelling lineage is real. You can go and trace the lines forward with people whom he had worked with or who wrote material later. The South African indigenous character types, namely, reappeared and they were reworked and redefined and refined with Andrew Geddes Baines' Kaaitjie Kekkelback. My name is Kaaitjie Kekkelback. I come from Katrefie. Daar is van water geen gebrek, maar skers van wyn en beer. This obviously came from Grietjie Drillbouten, from the Nieuwe Ridderorde. His influence on newspaper dialogues is also very visible. Newspaper dialogues and satirical voices. This pushed... Hang on, this is kind of a difficult part here. His influence on newspaper dialogues and satirical voices was pushed further into longer forms with the use of early Afrikaans, before Afrikaans was Afrikaans, with social commentary on society. The writer of Samenspraak tussen Klaas Waarzegger en Jan Twyfelaar, dialogue between Klaas Truthsayer and Jan the Doubter. This was dialogues in the newspaper, Het Kruidok Nieuwsblad. This was assembled as the first Afrikaans novel. The person who had wrote these dialogues was Henry Mirand. Henry Mirand performed as a child with Boniface in Bloeit and Kunst, his theatre group. And yes, our lineage is uneven. It does privilege certain voices first. Of course, the Dutch and the Afrikaans and the English, but only later does it widen. The mechanism. The mechanism is established in this period of time. This is what's important. Okay? The idea that life in South Africa, South African life, is worth dramatizing. Our conflicts, our language or languages that was developing or are still developing, right? Our absurdities, our moral arguments, our contradictions, that belongs on the stage and on the page, or on the page and on the stage. The mechanism, our life is worth dramatizing. That was what was established with Boniface. And Boniface matters not because he is the hero of this, but he stands at a point where storytelling turns into a mirror. And this is where South African identity begins to recognize itself in story. And once the recognition starts, it doesn't stop. The mechanism is there. It just continues from there. And it remains rooted in that same impulse of watching ourselves, arguing with ourselves, and performing who we are. And that is the beginning of the South African storytelling lineage. Wow. Now, guys, if you want to practice acting and you want an opportunity to, explore this storytelling lineage, then you are welcome to join us at Flight Art Acting's open rehearsal sessions. This is a low pressure, low cost space where actors who are aspiring or studying or amateur or professional or returning come together to explore the creative, pick up the monologue and dialogue, and let their art bloom. So that link is in the description. And folks, that's it. That's the lineage. That's the start of the South African storytelling lineage. Thank you so much, guys. I will see you in the next video. Okay, guys. Bye-bye.